Karl, tell us about what it was like working with Kurt.
Well, you want me to tell you first who I am and where I
No,
came
no,
from?
we'll have a title.
Oh, okay.
Well, when did you join KSA?
Yeah. Well, I graduated, Joe, from Carnegie Tech in 1940. Went with U.S. Steel and decided a big corporation like that wasn't for me. A boy by the name of Roy Hertzler, who was one of the original partners in KSA. I had known him for many years, and he called me in Pittsburgh. Wanted to know if I'd be interested in going in the needle trade industry. Well, immediately I thought, hell, they make needles, I guess. And it's true. And I hesitated, but he told me about KSA, which had been formed just previously, a few years earlier. So I took a train to Washington, D.C. and met with Kurt. And as a result of that meeting, I was very impressed with him. And as a result of that meeting, I joined KSA in April 1941. I think I was the 7th person hired by KSA. And I took a cut in salary to join him. We made the magnificent sum of $125 a month coming with KSA. So anyway, he sent me to Bristol, Tennessee under Charlie Russo. And Charlie was a great, great person for training people, a real personnel guy. And we had, after a 40-hour stint of standing up over operators and trying to improve productivity, we came back 3 nights a week and worked 3 nights a week with Charlie on KSA itself. And just about everybody that came out of there, came out of the training under Charlie, knew exactly what KSA's philosophy was, exactly what was expected of us, and it was an experience that I wouldn't exchange for anything, Joe. It was really good. Kurt.
Don't mention my name, even though you're talking to me.
Okay.
They won't know who you're talking to.
All right. Kurt himself was a remarkable person. I think probably I got to know Kurt as well as anyone in KSA and worked very closely with him for 37 years, roughly. His philosophy of life was that, in fact, his whole life was KSA. He didn't have any outside interests other than playing a piano and his family. And his love for family came into KSA's philosophy, if you will, or actual practice, if you will. A lot of people philosophize, but they don't necessarily put it in practice. Well, Kurt did. He knew every employee. He knew every employee's wife. He knew their family, their children. He never forgot birthdays. He was always there. If somebody was sick or anything happened, he was right there with a helping hand. And he lived that philosophy. And he lived KSA. Now, I must congratulate KSA today for the size and for the fact that they seem to have carried over the same spirit that KS himself imbued in us when we first came into KSA. The thing, Kurt had a lot of little sayings that he more or less lived by in KSA, and among some of the sayings that he had was, first of all, he always put the client's interest first, ahead of KSA's interest, if you will. Hopefully the two will be compatible, But if they weren't, the choice was always the client's interest first. The next thing he said, if you put the right person in the right place, things will begin to happen. And he lived that philosophy. We tried to do that in all, don't put square pegs in round holes. And where we did, where we were forced to do it, it never worked out. He had an exact philosophy on that. He always said, we hatch the egg that we lay. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, he meant that as opposed to the generalist consulting firms of the day, we specialized in one industry, and we not only made recommendations, which most of them, that was the end of their assignment, we implemented. We lived with it. We stayed with it until we got it done. And it happened. We had a big advantage over the generalists in that we were specialized by industry, and we knew the industry, and we knew what their competitors were doing. We knew what the pricing was. We knew what styling was. We knew all about the industry. It gave us a tremendous advantage as far as over the generalist consulting like McKinsey and people of that nature. Kurt also had a philosophy that as a consultant, we can't improve a company. There's no way that we can actually engineer or improve a company's bottom line. We can point the way, and we can map out a plan, and we can assist in the implementation of that plan, but in the long run, it's the company's own personnel that must be sold on the installation or whatever project we had underway, and who must implement it. We can only assist. So when we say, I engineered such and such a plant, never. We didn't. We engineered such and such a plant. The company did it. Not I as an individual. He also
is not infallible. Or
that's
can't
right.
do it all himself.
No, that's right. Kurt also said, don't try to bluff or lie. That's one thing that Kurt wouldn't forgive if he'd ever caught anybody in a lie, and he did once or twice. We had to release him. We got rid of him right quick. He said, if you don't know, do not be afraid to admit it. But say that you'll get an answer and that you'll come back with the answer at a later date. But don't try to bluff your way through it, because the one thing that he prided himself on was the integrity of the company, of the individual. And any one person could tear that down very quickly, and word would sure get around in an industry as closely knit as the apparel industry was at that time.
Well, and when a young engineer or consultant would have to find an answer, he had resources to go to.
Oh, Lord,
like
yes.
Charlie Russo, Roy Engman, Roy Hertzler,
That's right.
you, and so on. Tell us something about how you trained new consultants on the job. I often heard say during my career that no matter what they told you at Rodney in McRae, when you got on a job and Karl made promises for you that you had to keep, it was a whole new experience.
Well, actually, the initial training that we had, whether it was in a client's plant as a trainee at no charge, or whether it was in a Roydenware, which we owned at one time and had to give up because it grew so quickly that we were competing with our clients, and some of them didn't appreciate that. But the training that took place was as much on attitude and on how to approach people and on how to sell people on an idea, things of that nature, as much as it was the mechanical nature of learning to sew, of learning how to do a job. And
That hasn't changed. hasn't changed.
Hasn't it?
Yeah, it's the
They
same
do
thing.
the same thing.
You got to sell the client on a new way of thinking, right?
That's right.
You got to be persuasive.
Kurt had a lot of little tricks that some of you will learn as time goes on. I hope they still teach them. One of them was getting a person to write their name, write out their full name and time it. And normally, let's say that the time that it would take would be 20 seconds to write your name. Then he would say, okay, turn the paper over. Now I want you to write your name and leave out every other letter. Go. And he would start to time them. Well, they would only be writing half as many letters as you did when you wrote your full name. But it would take you at least as long, and usually longer, to write your name that way than it did the other. And they'd say, aha, now you wrote half as many letters, and if that were your name, half as many letters, you'd do it in half the time. But you had to stop and think. And that's why when you are learning a new way to do this particular job, it's going to take you longer at first, and you're going to get discouraged. But don't. Remember that you're only going to be doing less work, doing it the way we want it done, and you'll come out with more product and hence more earnings. And believe me, it was a good sales tool.
Reducing work content.
That's right. But it took twice as long when you first do it, because they had to think about it.
That's clever.
Another one was scratching his right ear with his hand.
That's it.
Yeah, and that's already in there. Somebody has said it. Another one was if they cut a new road to a store that you've normally gone to, and you have been going around the block this way, 3 blocks that way, but now you can go just like that. It'll take you a lot less time going this way than it will the old way. But it may be unfamiliar at first, and you may have trouble finding your way, but in the long run, it'll be a lot less for you. There are many little things like that. He used to use an old-fashioned toaster, and he'd give you 3 pieces of bread, and he'd say, okay, toast the 3 pieces of bread. Well, some people would go ahead and they'd put 2 slices in, toast one side, turn them over, toast the other side, take them out, and put the last one in and toast it. No, you put A and B in and do one side. Then you put C in and do the other side of A. Then you put B in and do both sides. It takes less time, less toasting. Many little things like that that Kurt imbued in us, if you will, and then some of us thought of our own.
He was a good teacher.
Oh,
Aphorism.
great teacher, great teacher. He used the old trick with the cigarette pack. It was a daisy. We used to have to write job descriptions, and you had to be very careful how you wrote a job description, because Kurt would say, all right, tell me how to smoke a cigarette. And he'd put the cigarette pack in his pocket. He'd say, well, take the cigarette out of your pocket. He'd reach over with one hand and try to get a cigarette pack out of his pocket. No, no, no. Take the cigarette out of your pocket with your left hand. Oh, so he'd grab a pack of cigarettes and he'd come out with a pack like this. No, you can't do that. You have to do it this way. And before he was done, the finale of it was, now take the cigarette to your mouth. And he'd take the cigarette and put the whole thing in his mouth, you know. He had all kinds of little things like that that were very, very good and impressed. Remember, we were working mainly with operators in those days. And not downgrading anybody, but some of them didn't have that high an education degree, but they could all understand things like writing your name. They could all understand. If you tried to get technical with those people in selling a rate, forget it. You'd never sell it. You had to get down and do it on their language level,
Right.
which is what we tried to do.
And he was a great communicator because he recognized how to communicate with people at all
That's
levels.
right, all levels.
Yeah.
Kurt, you know, when he came to this country, couldn't speak English. He had a high school that he had 1 or 2 years of English in Germany, but he really didn't know English. What did he do? He read the newspapers, the comic strips primarily, because in the comic strips they had the slang American language, which he felt he had to overcome. When I met him, he'd only been in here 6, 7 years in this country, and he spoke far better English than I did. He really mastered it, and he was really good.
Talk about yourself, please, a little bit. When you joined KSA, you came out of Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon. Did you indulge in any kind of sports while you were there?
One of the things that happened in the interview that we had in Washington, D.C., Kurt and his family lived at the Broadmoor at that time, and I had traveled all night on a train and got there. And
Broadmoor in Washington?
Broadmoor, yeah, Washington, D.C. That was Broadmoor in Washington. Yeah, I know there's one there, but this was an old Broadmoor building there. It was an apartment house.
Okay.
And during the interview, he said, are you analytical? And I said, well, I think so. He said, well, give me an example of how you were analytical. So I told him, well, while I was at Carnegie Tech, I was on the football team there. And we were playing Notre Dame, as a matter of fact. And I was captain of the Carnegie Tech team for that game. We had a new captain every game. And in those days, you couldn't pull people in and out in reverse. If you took a person out of the game, he was out for that quarter. He couldn't come back for another quarter. So we had practiced against an offense that Notre Dame used all week. And Lord have mercy, when we got in the game, they completely changed their offense for the game against us. And the defense that we had set up wouldn't work at all. So we called timeout, and we figured out our own defense against the new offense that Notre Dame had. And we happened to beat Notre Dame that year, 9-7. And it was one of the biggest upsets, I think, of the time.
How did that prove? You analyzed their different offensive.
Mm-hmm.
And responded.
So Kurt accepted that, and lo and behold, for many years afterwards, he would use that as an example with the new recruits coming in of analytical ability.
Was he impressed with the fact that you were an All-American?
Oh, I don't think Kurt was particularly impressed with football. When you said football to Kurt, he thought of soccer.
Right.
And I don't think at that point that he knew much about football. Kurt never was much of a sportsman, but he was a heck of a good sport. We played golf. We had meetings at the Greenbrier and at the Homestead. And Kurt couldn't play golf worth a darn, and neither could Luli. But Luli and Kurt and I and Jane, my wife, would get up before us and go out in the golf course. And we'd all get on the first tee and try to hit a ball, knock one out somewhere. Kurt's ball would barely dribble off the tee if it went anywhere. It went 10 yards or 10 feet. So we'd start walking down the fairway, and Kurt would say, "I'm a religious golfer." And you're what? He said, I'm a religious golfer. He said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first to hit again. So he had a real good sense of humor. He had a wonderful sense of humor.
When did you become president of KSA?
I really don't know. I don't.
And when did you became chairman after Kurt retired?
Well, Kurt had a heart attack while I was, at the time, I interrupted my KSA career joined the Navy and was in the Navy service during World War II for 2 or 3 years. And sometime after I came back, whether it was 8 years or 10 years, I don't know, Kurt had a heart attack. And when he had a heart attack, I more or less took over most of his duties, as well as the duties that I had at that time. And so for a period of about 3 or 4 months, I had to do most of Kurt's work for him. And I think it was shortly after that he appointed me vice president, and we only had one at that time, vice president. And then about 2 or 3 years later, president, and somewhat later than that, chairman of the board. So it's the dates don't really mean anything.
Right. Great.
Okay.
You want to say